Okay, good morning or good afternoon, everyone. I see we're jumping on the call and I want to welcome you. I'll give it just a minute for everyone to jump on. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Susan Kent and I'm with Talent Connections and Career Spa. I'm actually located in the Houston office, but I understand you all are in several different time zones, and we welcome you today. So thank you for jumping on. Good. Well, our topic today, you see, is the conflict advantage, and Kevin Phillips has been a featured speaker several times, so I know you will enjoy everything Kevin has to share with us today. So let me remind you that this is a 1-hour webinar. If you have technical questions, please call 888-799-9666, extension 2. And as participants, you are muted, but please use the chat feature at any time or the Q&A feature, and we'll be glad to respond to your questions. If not during the presentation, certainly we'll have the Q&A time at the end. This webinar is approved for 1 SHRM Professional Development credit, and we'll share that activity number at the end. So let me introduce Kevin. If you haven't heard Kevin, you'll be delighted with this hour here. He has a background with AT&T in an executive role, and he brings a lot of illustrations and experiences to share with us from his time there. But he's also a CEO of the KDP Group and the founder of Build Them Up, an excellent coach and consultant. So Kevin, welcome. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you and welcome. I am excited to be here. Conflict is hard. It's often scary. It can often muck up everything. And yet here I am suggesting that there's an advantage to conflict. I believe it strongly. Every team that is successful can usually trace some of its positive attributes, some of those attributes that make it most successful, to a level of cooperation among the team members. And that cooperation is almost fueled by a goodwill. When people often make mistakes or they cross a line, where there's goodwill, there's more grace and there's forgiveness. And so people tend to work better. And that tends to lead to better results and faster progress. But the problem is that conflict, especially unresolved conflict, destroys cooperation. It undermines goodwill and it hinders progress. And so most of us look at conflict in a negative way. And I'm not going to suggest that conflict is fun or that it is positive, because I don't think it's fun or positive. But what I'm suggesting today is that how you respond to conflict, how you handle conflict, can turn the outcome positive. I don't have any suggestions today that are going to make it fun or comfortable or easy. In fact, the truth of the matter is, I'll admit up front that I will be sharing some suggestions and techniques with you today that I am still trying to learn myself. I've been working on these most of my career. And I feel like if you were to compare how I manage conflict today to how I did it 10 years ago, you would see that I'm much improved. But in isolation, you would see I still make mistakes because it's hard. It's difficult. It's especially hard because conflict exists only when there are multiple people involved. In fact, when there's one person involved, you don't usually have conflict, right? And when you have a small group of people, especially if they've been together a lot, there's a high likelihood that over time, the people that you hang with, you tend to become more like them and think more like them. So in groups like that, conflict is less obvious. It is most obvious when people don't know each other well. It's most obvious when there are other things going on. And that, by the way, is exactly the time that navigating conflict in a healthy way becomes far more important. So let's talk about conflict. Conflict is almost always a natural response to differences, a difference in ideas about what's right or which direction to go or when to go or who should take the lead or where to start, when to start, how many stops along the way if you're going on a trip, if it's, what color to paint the living room. It could be, this is conflict not just for an office environment, it's conflict in any kind of environment. I think what we're going to talk about today will serve you in any relationship where 2 or 3 people are together. There's likely to be conflict, and I think these will all help you. But if you think about it, most of that conflict is rooted in difference of some sort. And as we talked about, it can be scary and painful. And sometimes when you try to do the best you can to address it, it feels like it gets worse before it can get better. And sometimes it doesn't feel like it gets better. People leave angry, they dig their heels in, they stake their position out, and they fight. And oftentimes what happens too is you see a host of behaviors that results in people kind of clicking off, right? So is conflict good or bad? That depends on how you respond to it. That's what we're going to talk about today. But unaddressed, I feel like it's fair for me to say, unaddressed conflict will almost always hinder the results that you're trying to achieve. So today, what I'd like for you to do is think about a conflict right now in your life, at work or at home, or perhaps in some professional organization or a social organization, maybe your homeowners association, a conflict that you need to be able to influence. And I'd like for you to listen to the rest of this webinar with that particular conflict in mind. I'm suggesting that there is an advantage to conflict, that there is an opportunity there. We discussed that conflict is most often a natural response to difference. It often brings out the worst. We often meet conflict with our ego, and we want to win, and we want someone else to lose. So we define the conflict in terms of winning and losing, and we become very selfish. I'm not saying that we're bad people. I think it's just a natural reaction that we want to win. Most people don't enter any competition with the goal of losing. Even though I was never much of an athlete, although I pretend to be one sometimes, I never really had the physical gifts that an athlete would have. But that didn't mean I didn't enter every athletic competition with the intent to win. I think it's natural when we enter a conflict, we want to win. But very often, the most unhealthy of reactions is what comes out. And our response often makes that conflict worse than it otherwise would be. You might know of some situations you've been in when you've seen that happen. And when you're in the middle of it, it's not as easy to see, but when you're maybe sitting on the sidelines and you're watching some other folks work through conflict, it's easier to see how unhealthy reactions make it worse. But within those differences are the seeds of advantage, and that's what we're going to talk about. Each of us has a unique value proposition. We have different gifts. We have different life experiences. We have different education. Some might have a long career in marketing. Others might be in operations, maybe in sales. We might be in different industries. Some might be teachers, some might be business people. All of those differences make us unique, and there's not another person like you. All of those strengths and those differences create a filter, if you will, a lens through which you view the world, where you view problems and opportunities. And so you will see a problem different than anyone else. There won't be anyone else who sees it exactly like you do, because you have this unique blend, and that is your gift to the team. Your differences are your gift to the team. And when you speak those differences, some people might bristle because they see it very differently. But a healthy response to those differences is not one where you compete with each other to win, but where you compete with each other to arrive at a better conclusion or a better decision or a better outcome than the individuals could have arrived at alone. If I am making the decision all by myself and I have only my own strengths and my own experience and my own education to use, I can reach a good decision most of the time, some of the time, a little of the time. But with input from others, I will have the advantage of things they see that I don't see. Now, have you ever witnessed a car accident? And there might be other witnesses, and the police come and they interview. And let's say you have 5 witnesses. There's a strong likelihood that if you were to compare those 5 witnesses, there would be a huge chunk of what they say that's the same. But it's not unusual for each of those witnesses to see something different, because one might have been on the west corner and one might have been on the east corner. One was from behind, one was in the car, One was in the other car and they saw something different. They were aware of different things. It's not that anyone is lying. They could all be telling the truth, but they didn't all see exactly all the same things. And that is the value of the differences on your team. And when we bring those differences together in a healthy way, when that difference is appreciated, we're better together. And that's the value proposition of a conflict. It's where you have people together with those differences and you can get them to speak them up. I always tell teams this, and to the extent when I'm the leader and I am recruiting and I'm choosing who's going to be on the team, I try to recruit for those differences. Sometimes you inherit a team and you're stuck with what you got, but chances are you're going to have differences. But I always tell them, if you have a different view, your gift is that difference. But if you don't speak up, we will not enjoy the benefit of your unique perspective. So being different and speaking up about that difference is how you contribute and how each one contributes. And then as the leader or as a peer on the team, how we react to those differences and how we're productive with those will make a difference in our outcomes. There are 3 stages of maturity in responding to conflict. And I think it's my experience that most of us spend most of our time in the first stage, including me at times. And I think over time, as we get better, maybe we've had some great coaches, we've had some life experiences that teach us, we begin to develop some maturity where we move into those other stages. But I find that most people aren't really spending most of their time in those other stages. Let's talk about them. Very often, and probably the most common thing you see when there's a conflict is people are afraid of it and they take steps to avoid it. They try to put Band-Aids on it. They try to, let's not talk about it. Or they try to talk about it in a way that doesn't really get to the differences. It doesn't really let people express themselves. They try to make it nice. And in the process, they're really avoiding the conflict that's underneath. And if you put lipstick on a pig, the pig still stinks. It's just an ugly pig. Lipstick on a pig doesn't make for a pretty pig. And that's what happens when you avoid conflict. It doesn't make the conflict go away. In fact, what happens is if you pretend like or deny that there's a conflict, the conflict continues to grow and it gets bigger and more difficult to manage later. But then we all know a few people who they actually enjoy conflict. Maybe they have an ego, they like to win, and so they will stoke the conflict so that they can have an argument. Excuse me. Maybe they just like to see the theatrics. And you've seen a few of these people who they'll get something started and then they'll go sit back innocently like they had nothing to do with it. And they'll just watch because it's entertainment for them. Both of these responses to conflict are destructive to the team, to the outcomes that you seek. But there is a higher level of maturity, and that is when someone will address the conflict. And I see this all the time where leaders are working hard to try to address it in a healthy way. And I do think very often that I spend a lot of my time right here too. Some of my skills have grown over the years, and I'm good at some of them, and others of them I'm still really rusty at. And so this doesn't always go beautifully. And I think one of my key messages to you today is don't expect to be perfect at all of these, but try them and see if you can't use them in an effective way. Today, we're not going to be talking about how to make an argument. This is not going to be a debate webinar, how to win points, how to score points. That's not what today is going to be about. Today, if you know me, you know that I'm all about the people advantage. I believe people are the competitive advantage that any organization has. And I think the greatest leaders are those who recognize that everything they do, as important as it is, the higher aspect of performing that role is to recognize the people aspects of it. And I think that's what great leaders do. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Addressing it, we have a conflict in front of us. How do we facilitate our way through this so that we can understand the conflict and get to a healthy outcome? But then there's a higher level of maturity. I don't see this as often. And I am myself working to get to this level of maturity. But it's where not only do I address conflict, but I actually embrace it because I see the value in it. I see what can come when the organization not only addresses individual conflicts, but addresses conflict behavior as a general rule. it addresses it as a whole. It becomes a cultural response to conflict. In addressing it, this is where an individual conflict is met. Very often we hire mediators, or sometimes in business, we'll hire a third-party facilitator to come in and help a team work through a conflict. And to me, that's what we're talking about addressing it. This embracing it is more of a cultural thing where you try to change the culture in a way so that it can appreciate the value of those differences. And these are constructive ways to respond to conflict. There's some mathematics involved here. If you avoid it, if you have team members who are avoiding it, you're really subtracting from the team's value. The team loses the benefit of those differences if they're unexpressed. If you have people on the team who like to stoke it, they're dividing the team. Very often you see cliques form, and then people start going to lunch together and they leave out the other people, and it becomes a thing bigger than the team. The conflict grows outside of the team and it creates division. Subtraction and division are not the mathematics of leadership. Instead, when you address it, you are additive. You bring the value of all those differences to the team so the team makes better decisions. And when you embrace it, it becomes multiplicative, because all throughout the organization, people are responding to conflict in a healthy way. The advantage is not the difference itself. And this is important. It's not just that someone has a difference that makes them valuable to the team. It's when they express it and the team responds to it in a healthy way. So it's what we create from all those differences that makes conflict an advantage for us. So think back about that conflict that you need to influence and ask yourself, where are you in that conflict maturity model on that particular one? Maybe that, someday you're avoiding, and then for the next conflict, maybe you're addressing. You're probably like me, you're at different stages depending on the conflict and depending on who I'm in conflict with. And that's okay. We want to move to the right on that conflict maturity model. So let's talk about, how do you navigate a conflict? How do we address it? How do we work through it in a constructive way? I think fundamentally, it's about dialogue. It's about getting people to express themselves. Dialogue is two ways. That's the DIA part of that. So there's a talking and a listening, and then a talking and a listening. It's two direction. And that's really the only way I know to break through conflict. But it requires some courage, because you have people who are afraid of it and they won't. You have people who enjoy it and they want to muck it up. And so as a facilitator, as a leader, or as a peer in this process, it takes some courage to step up and say, hey, let's handle this a different way. You can't get to the healthy side of conflict without dialogue. So we said that conflict is almost always a result of differences. So if you want to navigate a particular conflict, you need to start by understanding what those differences are. And sometimes before you even have a conversation, you should think about this, because you might know maybe there's a corporate program in place and three or four departments are involved. You can anticipate what some of those departments will think and where they will have battles, if you will, where they will disagree. So some of these differences you can anticipate, but sometimes differences aren't about the content of the discussion. It might be a difference about not only which direction we should go, but when should we start or how we should go about it. Sometimes it's about personality conflicts, right? Sometimes you're trying to accomplish a mission, but the personalities are conflicting with each other. And they might even agree on the purpose. They might agree on the set of facts. They might even make the same arguments, but the team is hindered because the conflict is the personalities, which gets to one of the differences. Sometimes there's a difference about who should be in charge. There are a lot of differences that you have to think about here. And if you're going to navigate a conflict, you need to try to understand what they are. Some of that can be done before you have a conversation, before you even bring up a contentious topic. But some of it might be as part of a conversation, you need to explore what those differences are, which brings us up to this other key point. As a facilitator, and even as a peer, because we're not always leading a team, we sometimes are, sitting there along other people who have equal responsibility to us, but we want to make sure that everybody feels heard. I don't know about you, but I feel much better about agreeing to something that's not my idea when at least I feel like people listened to my opposing view. And so I think this is an important part, is that all participants need to work to understand each other. And if you're facilitating a conflict, Not everyone has the skill to do it. Not everyone knows to do it. And even those who know to do it, not everyone wants to do it. There are a lot of reasons people get married to their ideas. And you may have to work hard to make sure that all sides are heard. If you have someone who is scared of conflict, they might not volunteer it. You may have to ask some questions to get it out. One technique that I have found that works really well here to make sure that all sides are heard and understood is to, as a general practice, say, hey, let me repeat back what I just heard you say. Let me paraphrase it in my own words to see if I understand. Sometimes you think you understand, but you didn't, which gets to the point of listening. It's probably one of the things that I have to work on the most, because I'm usually listening with the intent of how am I going to respond? I'm listening with the intent of comparing what I'm hearing to my view. Where are there differences? So in my mind, what's going on is I'm kind of organizing a table here of differences, things we agree on, things we don't agree on, which points I think aren't bad. It's almost like I'm taking notes in my head, which means I'm not really hearing what's being said. So I think for all of us, learning how to listen better, that paraphrasing is a great way to do that. Here's another technique that I try, and I find it very effective, not only to make sure that I am understanding, but I also find it can be a great technique to persuade others. And that is, what if I put myself in their shoes and honestly, not pretend, honestly try to make the argument from their perspective? In other words, how would I argue against myself? Sometimes in this process, I realize that there's a hole in my thinking. There's a gap in my logic. Sometimes I still reach the conclusion that I'm right, but by virtue of the fact that I can make their argument, it makes me better able to explain my view in a way that resonates with them. Making sure that everyone is heard is critically important. Choose your battles. Ask yourself, for this particular conflict, is this a hill that I'm worth dying on? One of my favorite bosses, Gil Dawson, used to say this all the time, because not every argument has to be attended, and not every conflict has to be wrestled. Now, you want this to be a deliberate decision. You don't want to walk away from a conflict without thinking through whether that conflict is worth the battle or not, right? You want to make sure that you have a deliberate decision that says this particular conflict is worth the investment. Let's go charge that hill. Or, this conflict at the end of the day, it's not worth it. I would rather preserve relationships. I would rather let them get whatever it is that they think so important. And there are bigger battles for me to fight. It's an important decision. Almost everything you do as a leader has to begin with yourself. What is my intent? What's my goal here? What is the outcome I'm trying to seek? Am I trying to win, or am I trying to get to a healthy decision? Am I trying to get the profit in a better place, or get this policy shaped up in a way that encourages customer loyalty more? What is the battle I'm really trying to fight here? Knowing that makes a huge difference. But also we need to check our ego, because ego gets in the way. I'd like to think I don't have an ego problem, but you let there be a conflict. And a lot of times in the middle of a conflict, I'm like, you know what? I am digging my heels in for only one reason, and it's not a good one. And it's because of my ego. I have to keep it in check. You might not have that problem, but I think there are probably a few others out there, if you're honest about it, that can get in the way as well. Also, check your filters. Every one of us have them. And the problem is we are so accustomed to those filters, we don't even know we have them. We don't realize that the information that we hear and that we see is being filtered by that. We don't realize that we have created an echo chamber for ourselves. And so that influences how we process information. It also influences how we explain our positions. And those filters can create a problem for you if you're trying to navigate a conflict. And if you're not careful, you can become fuel on the fire of the conflict. If you're going to navigate a conflict, if you're going to lead others to navigate a conflict, you're going to have to think about the conflict differently. We talked a few minutes ago about making sure you know what the goal is. What is the outcome you seek? Before you start in this path of navigating the conflict, what are we trying to actually accomplish? And make sure that you know what part of this is noise, what part of this doesn't really matter, and what part really matters. But also, do you really appreciate the differences? Does the team really appreciate the value add of others? And so you're not going to change people overnight. You're not going to change people in one conversation or in one meeting. But to the extent you can, what you want to do is recognize the value of those differences. And especially when you have invested yourself and you've built up the leadership capital and the relationship capital with the people there, they will listen to you and they will be influenced by you. And when they see you respecting those differences, when they see you responding to a difference in a positive way instead of a negative way, where you ask questions to understand instead of triggering a debate or attack, that will influence them. And if you only influence one person, that's a positive. An important part of this is to be able to communicate clearly. And I've already told you we're not going to spend time talking about how to structure the facts and structure the debate and present your logic. That's not the purpose of our talk today, but that stuff does matter. And I think it's important where the conflict is bigger, where the risk is higher. You want to spend as much time as you can before you get in there thinking through how you will communicate it. But don't forget that it is about facts, it is about logic, but there is a human component to conflict as well. And if you overlook that, you might not be successful winning the, if you will, winning the argument. At the end of the day, if people feel like they've lost, if people feel like they have been punished, if people feel like they've been singled out or made fun of or ridiculed, you might win a battle and lose the war. Don't overlook the emotional aspects of this. If you attend to those, you will have a better outcome. Let's say your conflict is over what kind of decision we're going to make or what our strategy is going to be. Even if you leave that meeting and everyone has given up and let you win, that's not a winning position, because you might have won an argument, but you need to win their hearts. You need them to go out and change their behavior or to go lead their teams to support the strategy. And if they feel beat down, you will not get that kind of change in behavior that you were seeking. You might get it on paper, you won't get it in practice. And that's why it's important, as we said, to know what is the outcome that you really want. Don't forget, it's powerful to stop. Take a walk around the lake. Break for coffee. And sometimes when you break for coffee or lunch, it lets people maybe go to lunch together and chat and get to know each other. And if it's especially inflamed, it gives people a chance to kind of lighten the atmosphere a little bit, to reflect and remember what's important. And sometimes in the heat of battle, I can get all worked up on the inside. Now I try to manage it so people don't know, but sometimes I'm all worked up on the inside. And when I get worked up on the inside, I'm not thinking as clearly as I think I am. But just 10 minutes away, 10 minutes of a break can make a huge difference in navigating that conflict. Conflict doesn't get resolved in silence. Dialogue is how you break through conflict. It requires some courage to have that dialogue, especially in a healthy way, but that's how you resolve it. Remember that conflict that you face. Ask yourself, what of these techniques could help you? Maybe you've tried some of them and you're probably good at some of these. There are some of those that I'm pretty good at. And then there's some of them I'm still having to work at. You're probably in the same boat. If you really want to get the advantage of conflict, though, you need the entire organization to think about conflict different. You need to build a culture that is friendly toward conflict, that appreciates differences. Now, you might not be the CEO, and so you might not be able to control the entire organization. But if you're a team leader, you can have a significant impact on how that team views conflict. And as you build influence with your peers, you can influence how they respond to conflict. Don't ever underestimate your ability to drive change yourself, even when you're not the top dog at the top of the org chart. One of the things that I have found in my own life is that, and I know this might seem strange, but the best relationships I have are strong because we have navigated some difficulties together. We might have had some pretty significant arguments, but because we worked through them in a healthy way, our relationship became stronger. I'm not saying you can't have a good relationship if there are no conflicts. I think you can, But I think the deepest relationships are forged through conflict. But there's a choice that has to be made when there's a conflict. Are you going to grow from it, or will you shrink from it? Will the relationship get stronger, or will it get weaker? I believe that relationships with peers, with employees, with customers, with suppliers, with leaders, that is one of the most important pieces of glue in any organization. Going through conflict together in a healthy way will make them stronger. You may not always see it at the moment, but in retrospect, I almost always can see that in my own experience. So if you want to change the culture to be more friendly to conflict, what do you want to do? And I think the first thing you want to do is you want your culture to not be afraid of conflict, to not run from it, to not hide it, to not hide from it, to not deny it, but instead run to it. Now, I'm not suggesting that you go out and create conflict, but where there is conflict, and there's always conflict, look for it, listen for it, look for signs, put in place some early detection, early warning systems. The sooner you get to that conflict, the better leverage you have on an outcome. I worked for Gail Dawson, I mentioned earlier. She used to always say, unlike wine, bad news does not get better with time. I think that applies here. But I always like to say, unlike coffee, conflict does not taste better after it brews. The best day to prevent conflict is before it starts. The second best day to prevent an explosion is the minute you become aware of conflict. Now, I'm not suggesting that every conflict you ought to pounce on with the same energy. What I'm suggesting is when there's a whiff of conflict, you want to know it as soon as possible so that you can make some deliberate decisions about what to do about it so that you can exploit an early advantage to get to an outcome that you and the organization needs. I don't remember which month, maybe June or July, I did a workshop called the Influence Equation. And it was really trying to get to the point that as leaders, we really are in control of very little. In fact, I don't have children, but I have lots of friends and family who do, and I like to chat with them and say, well, how much control do you actually have? And, you know, when they're really young, you think, well, I have a lot of control. I mean, they can't even walk yet. I can pick them up and put them where I want. And then you have to ask the question, yeah, but who decides what time you get up in the middle of the night? And one of my friends just got a puppy. And I said, how much in control are you? And he's like, I'm not in much control because he decides when I get up, when I go to bed. The truth is, even in life, we're not in control of all that much, but especially as a leader, we're not really in control of much. People have the ability to make all kinds of decisions, whether we even realize it or not, that either help or hurt our program. More success if you influence them than if you try to control them. And influence, I believe, is largely related to three things. It is the relationships that you have, how you communicate, and how you interact, the interpersonal capacity that you have created between you and others. If you want to navigate conflict, you want to build that kind of influence culture as well. You want to build a culture that really appreciates relationships and that appreciates open and honest communication and clear and brief communication. If you're going to ramble on and on, people are going to struggle to understand what you're trying to say. And so they're not likely to say, yeah, you make some sense. Or, you know, that second point you made, I hadn't thought about. But if you learn to be crisp and clear, then you can have more influence on people's thinking. And then I think you also want to reframe conflict for its advantage. And I think this has a lot to do with how you yourself respond to conflict. When there is a problem, the rest of the organization is watching you, and they're watching you closely. They're trying to figure out how you're going to react. And for many of them, how you react will influence how they will react when they have a conflict. And it's difficult because I am the kind, I love to solve problems. And so if I just get a whiff of a problem outside my office, I'm like on it, which is a problem with delegation that I need to work through too. We'll talk about that maybe in another workshop. But when I jump on a problem, I'm like all in. And then I become aware that people are watching me and they're going to mimic me. And I'm going to start seeing more of me around. And the truth of the matter is that's not what I want. And I have to be careful about that. If I am demonstrating that I see that there are seeds of greatness, there are seeds of creativity and innovation in these differences, If I am demonstrating that I know that together we can make a better decision than apart, if I can demonstrate that not all hills are worth dying on, if I can demonstrate these principles of good conflict resolution, I will see others taking on that same approach. We talked about this earlier, but in organizations, it's easy for people to get influenced by almost a black hole in some, you just get sucked in and you can't get out. And when you get sucked into the black hole, you start hearing what you want to hear, or you hear only what somebody else wants you to hear. And so then you're cut off from all the information. You have to work hard to make sure you're getting all the information as a leader. And you want to make sure that everybody in the organization is aware that echo chambers are destructive. If you are clicking off, the chances of an echo chamber are even higher. The great value here is when you expose yourself to differences, when you seek them out, when you learn to find people who have a different view. And I'm not just talking about different education. There are traditional aspects of diversity that we talk about, and those are valuable here, but there are others, different personality types. I like to surround myself, when I have the choice of forming my own team, I like to have people on the team who are drivers and some who are analytical. I like to have some who are very social and some who love spreadsheets. I don't want everybody around me to love spreadsheets, because then everything's going to be put on a spreadsheet, and not everything about business can be reduced to a spreadsheet. I like party planners, people who really enjoy and appreciate other people and spending time with them. Now, I'm not naturally a chit chatter. I'm naturally an introvert. Sometimes when I say that, people say, no, that's not you. But I really am naturally an introvert. I get my energy from being alone and doing things, by myself. I love other people. I love being with them, but then I need some time alone. I need to refresh. And you might know what that means. But I have found, if I'm not careful and I surround myself with people like me, not all the needs of the organization are met. Not all the differences get expressed, and therefore we're not as optimized as we need to be. So I like to have the party planner with me. I like to have somebody who is going to question everything I say, not because I like conflict, but because I know I am better off for that. So there are a lot of ways here that you want to make sure that you're appreciating difference and looking for those differences, recruiting for those differences are valuable. And then we talked about this a minute ago, modeling it and coaching it. You demonstrate these behaviors, you'll see more of it. Where you don't see it, coach to it. And this is one of those things, you can model it in a meeting. You can model it, even in the case where maybe you're in a town hall and you're up speaking in front of a couple hundred people, you can still model this behavior there, but especially in a conference room where it's a smaller group. But one-on-one is a great place to model it. Ask others for their opinion if they're not giving it. Seek to understand. Seek to pull out those people who are afraid of conflict. Make it as comfortable as you can. You're not going to make it easy. In fact, I did a workshop, I think in April, about growth and tapping potential. And we talked about the fact that growth never occurs in a comfort zone. It occurs where you're uncomfortable. And so conflict makes most everybody uncomfortable. And some people, it makes so uncomfortable, they almost shut down. So, you want to build a culture where you make it safe for there to be conflict and make it okay, and try to help people get the skills so they're more comfortable with it. I mentioned this earlier. Conflict doesn't get better with time. It gets worse. And the worse it gets, the bigger it gets, the more difficult it is to solve. You want to find it early so that you can take advantage and leverage that early detection, if you will, for your best opportunity. Now think back at the conflict that we talked about that you face. How can some of these principles help you? I realize that many of you already do some of these, and that's great. And I would welcome you reaching out to me. And if you have some other suggestions, or if you think there's something I've left off, I'd love to hear about that. Or if you have a special insight on something, I would love to hear that. So I'll share my contact information, and you can certainly reach out to me. If you have a story to tell, I'd love to hear it. Let me tell you a story. This happened maybe 6 or 7 years into my career. I was on a team that had a lot of different departments. We were asked, it was a re-engineering project. So the company was trying to find a more cost-effective way to do something that we had to do as a critical business function. And so they pulled people from all the affected departments, put us in a conference room together for a little bit over a year. We knew that the departments that sent us to this team did not want any of this done. No one wanted it except the corporate, but it was going to happen. And so we were kind of in an impossible situation. Each of our organizations sent us to defend our organization's goals. Instead of what the corporation was trying to do, we were each kind of sent to fight for our department. And so we were naturally in a position where there was conflict every day, every meeting, every topic. We didn't agree on anything. If somebody said, what are we going to get for lunch? We wouldn't even agree where lunch should come from. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but not that much. But what was odd is when we would go to lunch, we got along well. We had fun, we laughed, but as soon as we'd get back in that conference room, it would be chaos again. Now, this was not chaos in the sense that things were flying. People they weren't cursing, but man, their passions were inflamed. There was a little bit of fist pounding and, a lot of nonverbals like this. And one of my favorite people from that team wasn't my favorite person at the time. Her name was Pat. She had more experience than all of us. She knew a lot more than all of us, and she didn't like anything. And she could roll those eyes better than any teenager I have ever met in my life. Pat, I learned so much from Pat in the process, but it was a difficult journey. We had a boss, however, Carmen. If you've listened to my workshops before, you've probably heard me talk about Carmen. We call her the Queen Frog, and there's a story behind that, but she loves frogs. Carmen had a way about her. Carmen knew instinctively when to let there be discussion and how far to let it go before she would create a pause or change the topic or start asking questions. When you ask questions, people have to start, their brain has to change a little bit because now they're digging for certain things. And it can almost be a very effective way to change the discourse of a meeting, but also to change the tenor of a meeting. And so Carmen is really good at it. Carmen also knew that there were times when what she needed to do is let the passion that she was managing and holding back to let it come out. Because sometimes we needed to see some passion from her to help direct the team. What I learned in that year, working for a leader who's very effective at navigating conflict, is that not only did we accomplish what the corporation set us out to do, we did it in a way under Carmen's leadership that our individual departments were able to accept and embrace it. We did it in a way so that we had the opportunity to each grow personally and professionally. And much of what I learned about conflict that I use in my personal life and in my professional life, I learned from Carmen. I'm still in touch with Carmen. She is retired. She took an early retirement because she wanted to teach high school. And I don't know about you, but that's pretty scary to me. And talking about rolling of eyes, I would imagine she taught higher math. So I imagine she probably saw a lot of rolling eyes. But Carmen was amazing. And I still talk to her. In fact, I talked to her a few weeks ago, and she is still coaching me. Conflict can be an advantage to you, but only if you take care of it in a thoughtful way, in a way that considers the people that are involved. Stephen Covey says strength lies in differences, not similarities. I always tell my teams, if we're all alike, then every one of us except one is redundant. No one wants to be redundant. Your value is in the difference you bring. Do it respectfully, but speak up and share it. And let's work together to hear each other's differences. Difference itself is not good or bad. It's what we do with it. And what we do with it and how we go about it will either bring value or it will destroy something about the team. It could destroy the team or it could destroy some business objective. But if you're unhealthy about dealing with conflict, it doesn't create value. It hurts you. And finally, Christopher Avery says it this way: differences in perspective. And we talked about all those different kinds of differences, all those different flavors of difference. When they're aimed, now think about the deliberation. When they're aimed, when someone says point it in this direction, and it's pointed at a common goal, not each other, it becomes powerful. And that's the purpose as a leader of navigating conflict. You will not solve that which you refuse to confront. If you'd like a copy of today's slides, you can go to kevinphillipsslides.com. You'll be able to subscribe to my newsletter and you'll get a copy of the slides. You'll also have contact information there for me, or you can go to howdykevin.com and it will, you'll be able to get access to my website and my social media. I'd love to connect with you on any of the social media. Love to exchange emails. I'd love to hear from you. I welcome any kind of communication back from you. So, Susan, do we have any questions, or perhaps we can ask folks to offer up some questions?
Yes, please. This is a great time to field your questions to Kevin, and you can either use the chat feature or the Q&A. So let's see, Kevin.
So I can't see them, so you'll have to.
Yeah, I'll be glad to relay those to you. Here's a question. What if you are not the team leader? How can you best influence others?
Much of my career, I have needed to influence a conversation when I was not, in fact, the boss. And that is far more challenging. When you're the boss, you can just make a decision. And that sometimes makes it seem like it's easier to navigate conflict. And truth is that doesn't help you navigate it better sometimes, because that puts the pressure on you and you are more in need of hearing those differences. But when you are sitting there around the table with peers, how you influence it, I think, has a lot to do with we talked about the influence equation a few minutes ago. The relationships that you have formed before you get in there, the depth of those relationships will have a huge impact on your ability to influence, but also how you communicate and your ability to speak briefly but clearly. And I think those are things you can practice and learn over time. To the extent you're going to go into a discussion and you know there's going to be conflict, I always like to think through who is going to be in there. What do I know about them? Because that will help me guess as to what they might suggest, what their views would be. And then I try to use that to think through, okay, do I agree with that or not? And if I don't, why? So that I'm prepared when I get in there. I think the best way to influence peers is build relationships and model the behaviors you want to see in them. Now, will it change everybody? No. Will it influence everybody? No. But if it influences one, you've made progress. If it influences two, you've doubled that progress.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Another question. How do you help people be more open in the conflict, meaning be more willing to dialogue rather than be stuck?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a really good question. There are a lot of factors into why people react the way they do. And some of it has to do with their personality. Some of it has to do with past experiences with conflict. They've either had a success record, and so they're more likely to be open, or they've maybe not had such a good track record and they feel like they lose all the time, and so they're less willing. So to the extent you know them, to the extent you've built relationships with them ahead of time, again, that is always going to be the best situation, because then you could, even before you get into that meeting, talk to somebody who you think is likely to be less open, and maybe one-on-one, they'll be more willing to share with you, or you can coax it out, or you can maybe even coach them a little bit without them even knowing that you're coaching them. But oftentimes you don't have the luxury of talking to somebody ahead of time. And it may be that there are people in there you don't know. And so I think the best way is to ask questions, but to ask questions in a non-accusational way, ask open-ended questions. And I think paraphrasing things back is a great way when they do share. It's a great way to make sure that they have expressed themselves, because if they've left something out or it didn't make sense, if you paraphrase it back and they can see there's a gap, that gives them a chance. If they're not going to talk at all, I think questions is a great way to do that, and say, hey, Valerie, I know that you used to work in marketing. What do you think would be a great way to tackle this? How you ask the question matters, and the tone in which you ask it will matter as well. Sometimes, by the way, I'll share this too. I have often found myself, and I'm not proud of this. I'm being honest. I don't even know who all's on this call, so this might be a mistake. But I have oftentimes paraphrased things back, but I know what I'm trying to accomplish, and so I will paraphrase things back in a way that almost would make it difficult for them to say, yes, that's what I meant. And that's not an honest way to dialogue. And so I think we have to check ourselves. I have to check myself to make sure that I'm not doing something that would stamp down someone's openness.
Good. Another follow-up question then, how do you check your filters and blind spots?
The absolute best way is to find someone that you can trust who will call you out on them, because you don't know that you have them usually. We all have them, and so you have to go look for them. You have to ask yourself, what am I missing here? Okay, I've just heard this said, I've read the spreadsheet, I see the data, I have formed this conclusion. Is there another way to look at it? And one of the best ways, again, I mentioned this earlier, is argue the other side. Genuinely try to take that same spreadsheet and try to argue the data a different way. Hunt other perspectives. Challenge yourself. Say, well, what if that's not true? What else could be true? I don't know of another way. But the best way is to ask feedback from somebody you trust. They know what filters you have, unless they're like you. Be careful. Don't ask for feedback from somebody in your clique, because now you're just creating an echo chamber. Ask for feedback from your boss. And I often will, especially I do this with direct reports. I will, if we're going to go into a meeting where there's going to be some conflict, I'll say up front, before we even get in the meeting, hey, this is going to be contentious. We're going to be healthy about the way we do this. At the end of this, I'm going to ask you for some feedback on how I handled myself. Now, sometimes they don't want to. Sometimes they don't trust me enough. What I can tell you is over time, as they are with me more, as we work better together, we have more trust, and they're more willing to say, Kevin, you stunk today.
I doubt if you've heard that, but
Thank you.
One follow-up question. Do you ever encourage side conversations when negotiating or discussing conflict in a large group, or encourage breaking into smaller groups?
I think it's always a good idea, but how you do it, I think would depend on the situation. There might be times when you'd want the 3 marketing people to go off and work on something together. But generally, I think if you send 3 marketing people off, you're going to get back a marketing answer when maybe they're just going to reinforce the views they already have. So I think sometimes it's a good idea, if you have a large group, to take a marketing person and a salesperson and a customer service person and send them off and give them a task, give them a specific task that they need to go tackle. Don't just let them go ramble on. Give them something in a time frame so they feel some pressure to get it done. I think that when smaller groups, if you have a big group, it's really difficult to manage the team dynamic. So oftentimes the best way to do is divide and conquer like that.
Okay, thank you. So on the topic of someone who stokes the conflict, how do you suggest handling a situation when there is that one team member who really enjoys throwing fuel on the fire?
Well, there's not an easy answer here. I have several thoughts, but at the end of all of those thoughts is this: you have to address it with them personally. And if you have a relationship with them, it's going to, again, make it easier for you to do it. If you don't have a relationship, though, you'll have to muster up the courage to address it. I think it's always better to do it one-on-one if you can. And it's people like that are going to usually deny it. And so you're going to need to say, well, you remember when so-and-so said this and you said that, and then you're going to need to be specifics, and you're going to have to hold the mirror in front of them because they're going to deny it because they enjoy it too much to let go of it. And if they're found out, they're not going to let go of that. So I think you're going to have to talk to them directly. Now, you'll have to escalate this at some point. If you are the leader of the group, it's going to be different than if you're a peer. But let's say you're a peer. At some point, you could talk to them individually, especially if you have a relationship. But then maybe you need to go talk to the team leader because it's something the team leader needs to address. What's the team leader going to do, or what can the team leader do? Address it with them directly through, feedback and coaching. At some point, bullies might need to be terminated, or maybe it's not terminated from the company, but removed from the team because the team can't function without them. And I think you don't want to start with that position, but you want to keep in mind, if we're moving in a direction that's getting there, you probably want to get there quickly so that it doesn't contaminate the team.
Okay, thank you. A follow-up question, and maybe this is something that they need to address with you one-on-one, but the question is, can you suggest a model for resolving conflict or a framework to follow?
So there are several that have been influential with me. My favorite book to recommend in the last 12 months, I'm going to recommend it again. It's called Radical Candor by Kim Scott. It is an amazing book. I've read it 3 times. The context of the book is about, well, I'll say it this way. The book is, if you want to change a person's behavior, you will only be able to do that when you speak the truth to them, but they will never be able to act on that truth if you don't speak it from a place of genuine love and care. All right, that's the premise of the book. It's really more about managing direct reports, and it gets into giving feedback and performance reviews and things like that. But the principles that she teaches, it's an excellent framework for navigating any conflict. I would recommend it. There are a couple other books out there, and I'm happy if you want to reach out to me directly, I'm happy to share some of those others about how to have difficult conversations. And there's one book that it's kind of an older book. I'm not even sure if it's still in print, but I still use it today. It is Difficult Conversations. I don't remember the title, but each chapter is the name of a difficult conversation you have to have with an employee, and it talks you through how to have those conversations. So I'm happy to share more, but I definitely start with Radical Candor by Kim Scott.
Okay, do we have any other questions from our participants today? I'm sure if you have any, Kevin would welcome you contacting him directly, and I would encourage you to connect with him on LinkedIn, Kevin D. Phillips. And yes, there will be this recording will be available on our website at talentconnections.net, and you'll see not only this webinar but other webinars that have been recorded, and you can view those. And just to remind you that this has been approved for 1 professional development credit for recertification through SHRM. That activity number is 2033XA9. And be sure to note that activity ID number on your recertification form. So Kevin, thank you. Another great webinar. And again, I encourage everyone to reach out. Someone had asked about your email address to repost that.
Sure, it's kevin@thekdpgroup.com.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, everyone. We appreciate you signing on. And Kevin, thank you again. And we hope everyone has a wonderful holiday.
Excellent.
Happy Thanksgiving.